This video is going to be an overview of one of the three question types you'll encounter on the verbal section of the executive assessment, the sentence correction. So sentence corrections are always going to be about 3 to 5 of the questions in every 14 question verbal section. It can vary slightly from 3 to 5, but generally that's going to be what you can expect. And you're going to have 1 to 3 sentence corrections in each 7 question half. So remember that in the executive assessment that you can jump around, skip, and return to questions within a given half because this exam is adaptive by half, not by every question. And these questions do have the least to read for any question type on the verbal section. It's in the name. It's only one sentence. It's a sentence correction. Now, there are several strategic implications of the format here. First is that you have to assume a relatively fast-paced 90-second per question average for these question types. That is going to be about 30 seconds less than your average of just over two minutes and 5 seconds for any average verbal section question. Now, you're going to have a maximum of 2 minutes for any sentence correction. So your maximum on a sentence correction has to be shorter than your average for each of the three types combined. And you have to limit yourself to a single reread before you decide to eliminate what you know to be incorrect and guess to save time. These questions do just have to go faster. And oftentimes, if you get stuck between 2 or 3 options on a sentence correction, it doesn't necessarily get better with more evaluation. So you have to stick to, I'm going to read it once at the beginning, once when I try to determine whether my answer is correct, and that's it. If I find myself having to reread each of the answer choices into the sentence, that's a good indicator I need to get off this question to make sure I've got enough time for the rest of the half. And also remember that generally in the EA, you can sacrifice 2 to 3 questions in a half and still reach a potential target score for most programs. And you will want to consider skipping proactively certain sentence corrections if you plainly cannot understand the sentences written. That's the most important thing. If you find yourself, again, just not understanding what the sentence is trying to say, allow one reread, but then eliminate things. Maybe you can identify that it has to be past tense versus present tense, or you can quickly determine that it needs to be a conjunction of but and not and. Those sorts of things you can evaluate quickly, but you have to move on if you're struggling to understand the intended meaning of the sentence, because ultimately meaning is going to be more important than grammar for these questions. So let's take a look at a sample sentence correction. About as simple as it comes. And the sentence correction format is always going to be the same. You're going to have a single sentence with an underlined portion. And that underlined portion is what you are able to evaluate. Everything else has to be assumed correct as written. So the quick brown and lazy dogs part of this sentence has to be correct. We cannot change it, but we have to evaluate the fox jump over that underlined portion to complete the task of the question. And choice A is always the original as written. You don't have to reread choice A. It is the underline as presented. And choice A is correct as frequently as any other choice is. So don't assume that there has to be something wrong with the sentence as it's presented. Fully 20% of the questions for sentence corrections on average, the correct answer is the original. Don't feel like you have to force an error if there isn't one that's immediately obvious to you. Then choices B through E present varying alternatives for just that underlined portion. Again, we're evaluating fox jump over and then we're going to compare that against the lazy dogs at the end and the quick brown at the beginning. So you will want to read the sentence as it's written, basically ignoring the answer choices to start. So we see the quick brown fox jump over the lazy dogs. Okay, simple enough sentence. Now you want to clinically and visually analyze the information in the original sentence to determine if you can come up with an error as it's written. So the quick brown fox, you can describe a fox as the and quick and brown. So that's fine. But the fox jump, well, that's an incorrect subject-verb agreement because fox is a singular noun. It needs the singular verb of jumps, not jump. And generally in English, one in a subject-verb pair will end in S. This isn't perfect because English is a inconsistent language in some ways. For instance, the plural of the noun deer, an animal in the forest, is deer. But you can use the non-underlined portion to help identify which is the correct number in those instances. But in this case, fox jump, definitely incorrect, and we can eliminate choice A. Then we can move to the next choices and consider whether they fix the error or introduce an additional error that we might be able to see. Again, we're not reading all of these choices back into the sentence. We're just going to look at them clinically. So in choice B, we switch to foxes jumps, and it makes the exact same error as the original. It just changes it to where it's a plural noun being paired with a singular verb. So foxes jumps is as wrong as fox jump. And we also introduced subtly this new pronoun of their as opposed to thee. The lazy dogs just describes the dogs as specifically a certain set of dogs. Their, T-H-E-I-R, that pronoun indicates that the dogs belong to the fox, and that would change the meaning of the sentence and not articulate what it originally intended. So there are two reasons we can eliminate choice B. Then looking at choice C, fox jumping over the lazy dogs. Well, now we've changed the verb from jump to jumping, and that just describes the fox. And in fact, we never have an action for the fox in this answer choice because now it's just a bunch of modifying phrases that all go back to that noun of fox, and the fox never does anything. We'd have the quick brown fox jumping over the lazy dogs. And since we just described the fox, we need to have the fox actually do something. And it doesn't. So choice C is also incorrect. But for a slightly different variation on that subject-verb agreement issue, this creates what is known as a fragment. Then we've got the quick brown fox jump over a lazy dogs. Well, here we have, again, the wrong subject-verb pairing because we should have fox jumps, not fox jump. But we also, once again, have a subtle change in the article. We go from the lazy dogs to a lazy dogs. Both of those are incorrect as well because, again, we've already established you have to have a singular noun pair with a singular verb. And in a different numerical error, we have a lazy dogs. A describes a singular item as opposed to a plural item. So A is incorrect in a similar fashion to the way that there was incorrect when it subtly switched from the to these other options. And then finally, we get to fox jumps, and fox jumps is the correct subject-verb pair for the noun and the verb in this sentence. And we maintain the meaning by saying over the lazy dogs. We just read this option that we've now clinically evaluated once more back into the sentence to confirm it captures the intended meaning. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dogs. And yes, it does. There is no new error introduced, and we have our correct answer. So let's talk about what we just did from a process standpoint. Step one is you have to read the full sentence and try to identify and articulate a common error in the original as it's written. And we're going to delineate what all of those common errors are here in a moment, but we already saw a couple of them: subject-verb agreement, pronouns, and article number. Then step two is if you find an error, then you eliminate choice A, and you want to just scan the remaining answer choices to see if any others repeat that category of error. This is how you maximize efficiency so that you don't have to reread each of those answer choices, and you're going to come comfortably in underneath that 90-second average that we're aiming for with sentence corrections on the executive assessment. But if no error is identified, you just keep choice A, but then seek small differences in the other choices to help identify those common errors that we're going to talk about as reasons to eliminate. So you'll just look for differences in pronouns and articles. You'll look for differences in verbs and verb tenses. You'll look for differences in comparisons and descriptors so that you can clearly determine specifically what the correct answer should be, again, as opposed to listening, quote unquote, for the error. Then step three is you're going to continue to evaluate those choices for succinct, specific errors until theoretically only one choice remains potentially error-free. And then step four, you want to read your selection back into the original sentence as we did with the quick brown fox to ensure it captures the intended meaning of the original without introducing any new errors in intended meaning. So that's our process. Now, of course, what are those common issues that we need to evaluate? Well, they're all going to be affecting potential errors in meaning. So first is subject-verb agreement. This is what makes a sentence a sentence. You need to have a subject, you need to have a verb. So difference in number, we basically evaluated that in our example. I like to use dogs run versus dog runs as my default just to think about, but you need an S to end one of the two in the subject verb pair. So dogs run, a dog runs. But we also have to make sure that we have a complete sentence. So no fragments and no run-ons. A fragment, like we saw in choice C before, has no verb for the main subject. And that is an incomplete sentence, not acceptable on the exam or really in English. And alternatively, you can have a run-on sentence, again, more of an advanced and rarer issue, but where you have multiple subject-verb pairs mashed together within one sentence without proper conjunctions or grammar or punctuation. So you have to make sure that you don't have, for instance, the dog ran away, then becomes the conjunction. The dog ran away, the dog ate its breakfast. You have to have some sort of conjunction such as then to make those two subject-verb pairs match properly within a single sentence. So our next issue is also tied to verbs, and that's verb tenses. Timing, one of the most basic things that you have to keep straight in English. Past, present, future. There are more complexities when it comes to past perfects and subjunctives and all of those sorts of things, but don't really worry about that. Focus instead on meaning and making sure that not only do your tenses match grammatically, but they match the intent and chronology of the sentence based on what the meaning is trying to articulate. So don't auto match your tenses, say that they all have to be past tense, they all have to be future tense, because you can, again, have different tenses based on the chronology that the sentence is trying to articulate. Then you also have conditionals, and that's the difference between saying, I will do my homework versus I would do my homework. And you have to maintain the intended meaning of the original sentence at all times. So what that means is you can't suddenly have a will turn into a would or vice versa. Because if I say I will do my homework, it's absolute. There's no doubt as to whether or not that's going to occur in the future. But if I say I would do my homework, that introduces a condition for the verb of doing my homework that hasn't been explained. So you have to make sure that you don't have that subtle change. It, again, is something that you can easily overlook if you're not aware that it can happen. Then we have pronouns and articles. This most basically is going to be a difference in number. So it's the difference of it versus they. So the dog has its bone. The dogs have their bones. So again, just difference between singular versus plural. But also beware of this in terms of articles, the difference between the and a, for instance. And it may be as well in terms of ambiguity. So, for instance, with the and the a example, if I say, I want the banana, I need the specific banana. If I want a banana, I can have any banana. And this can also illustrate itself in a sentence kind of like what we have on the screen. Bill, Bob, and Brent are at the store and he bought gum. Well, who is he? We don't know, and you cannot have ambiguous statements like that on the exam. So you want to aggressively seek these three errors in every sentence and in every choice, because these are the ones that you can track back to the non-underlined portions uh, of the sentence to make sure that you're definitively certain that they are right or not right based on how they have to match to those portions that we know we cannot change. Then we go to our more meaning-based issues. So modifier absurdity, first off, often tested on this exam. So you start with placement. So we'd have something like the greatest painter, Pablo Picasso's Guernica, would be an error in meaning because you can't describe the painting Pablo Picasso's Guernica as a painter. Make sure that your descriptors are properly next to the item that they are intended to describe. Similarly, you have to keep track of adjectives and adverbs. There is a very subtle difference that, again, in like advanced questions they can ask about. It's the difference between saying I run slow versus I run slowly. One of these is actually incorrect. I don't run slow. I am slow. It's the thing that I am. But I run slowly describes the characteristic of my action of running. So slowly is what is known as an adverb. Slow is an adjective. So an adjective can only describe nouns, whereas an adverb can describe verbs, other adverbs, and adjectives. So just a really subtle distinction that you may find on some of the harder sentence corrections on this test. Then parallel lists and comparison. So this basically falls under the category of parallelism. So grammatically, everything has to match in a list. For instance, you could say, I ate, I ran, and I slept. All simple past tense verbs, that's okay. But it also has to match in terms of concept. So you can't say something to the effect of my favorite teams are the A's, Raiders, and I like Man U because I've changed the form of my list for that third item. You have to make sure that it matches in concept and in terms of the grammar that's used. And then our last of our common meaning errors are idiom. And idiom are just the memorized rules of English that are the way that they are. And you have to make sure that you're 100% certain of an idiomatic error if you encounter one. So your memorized English rules, you just know these. And if you know that fewer counts number and less counts an uncountable amount, you didn't even need to see this on the screen. But if you didn't, it might be new to you and you might misremember it on the exam. Try your best to memorize some of the more common idiomatic phrasings in English, such as this one. So it'd be there are fewer seconds remaining as opposed to there's less time remaining. Again, just in terms of which are countable the seconds are, time as an amount is not an abstract concept. But if you're sitting there looking at two differences between wherefore and whereas, make a decision, or even better, look for a different issue, because oftentimes there's more than one of these 6 errors in meaning in a given answer choice. We even saw that in our example. If one issue is difficult to adjudicate, look for another one. Very often it's one of those first 3 that we talked about aggressively seeking in every choice, because those pronoun errors, those verb tense errors, those subject verb agreement errors, they are definitive, and you'll feel a lot better when you track them carefully, because you'll say, I know that's right, as opposed to trying to remember idiom. So for that reason, idiom is the final issue to evaluate unless you are absolutely certain of the error and how to fix it. So you want to use these 3 errors in meaning: modifier absurdities, parallelisms in list in comparison, and idiom, only if you're absolutely certain of the error they make in terms of the intended meaning, if you're going to use them as part of your evaluation for a sentence correction. So those are our errors in the meaning, and that's our process. Let's go over to the whiteboard and take a look at an example so you can see how it works live in action. So we have a sample sentence correction here on the board. We're going to set up our scratch pad as we do for every problem on this exam, so that we've got our locations for process of elimination and a little line over top where we'll actually write out what the error that we're evaluating is, if we can find one. So when you engage with a sentence correction, start reading it very deliberately. And if you find an issue, you can just list it on the line. And in this example, I'm going to see multiple issues, but if you don't see one issue, recognize that you could potentially go further and find an easier one for yourself. So the first issue might be a little bit challenging in this sentence. Though the growth rate has subdued some, this was remarkable. Okay, so this may quote unquote sound okay, but the growth rate has subdued some. Well, some makes it sound like the growth rate has actually stopped someone from doing something, like a person, and that's literally an absurdity. So this would be an absurd modifier. But you have to be certain of it from a meaning perspective and not from the grammar. So let's say you don't see that one. We just keep going. So the growth rate has subdued some. This was remarkable because it had nevertheless extended the current growth streak to 5 years, or 1 year longer than that of the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. So if we see the word than, that means that we're dealing with a comparison. And anytime you have a comparison in any sentence correction, you're going to want to carefully evaluate the parts of that comparison to make sure that they are like items, both grammatically and conceptually. So let's consider part 1, and then we've got our than, which is our transition here. And then we're going to have our part 2 of the comparison to make sure that this is logically apt. So we find that it had nevertheless extended the current growth streak to 5 years, or 1 year longer than. So part 1 is the growth streak. And then we get to 1 year longer than that of the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. So this makes it sound like a streak has its own streak as a possession, and that's logically absurd. So we can potentially fixate first on this issue of the comparison. So we know that choice A is out because that is an inaccurate comparison. I can't compare a growth streak to a growth streak that another growth streak had. It just doesn't make any logical sense. So then we can just focus on this one issue involving the comparison as we go through choices B, C, D, and E the first time. So I'm literally going to not go back to the beginning of the sentence, and I'm just going to go to where we pick up our comparison. So choice B, it recently extended the growth streak, or it recently extended the current streak of growth. We've changed it now to 5 years or 1 year longer the next. Here, it's the same issue, but not the exact same iteration. We lost our than. We need the than as the comparative term, so B is out because it loses the comparative word that we need to compare one growth streak to another. Now, choice C, we go to the end for the comparison again, extending the current streak of growth to 5 years or 1 year longer than the next most recently. Well, before it was most recent. And if we say recently consecutive cargo growth streak, well, it's supposed to describe the streak, which means that we need an adjective. So this would be, again, categorically a slightly different issue. It's a modifier error, but it's all in the same spot and we don't have to reread the whole sentence again. So then we go to choice D. It extended the current streak of growth to 5 years or 1 year longer than the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. And I'll just use a little squiggle here and say that at least has a proper comparison. So that's an improvement. And then the last choice, E, we've got the current streak of growth to 5 years or 1 year longer than the next most recent. And that too has a correct comparison. So now we just want to look for small differences between choices D and E to adjudicate. And we've got growth rate was subdued some compared to rate of growth was subdued somewhat. And there is a clear change in meaning between some and somewhat. Somewhat actually introduces some sort of question, whereas subdued some is just a quantifier. So choice E is also a modifier issue in that it changes the intended original meaning. So we'll now go reread choice D into the sentence as our second time reading the sentence in its entirety. Remember, only want to do this twice, once at the beginning, once at the end. But though the growth rate was subdued some, it was nevertheless remarkable because it extended the current streak of growth to 5 years or 1 year longer than the next most recent consecutive cargo growth streak. And that captures the intended meaning of the original without introducing any errors and is our correct answer. So go ahead and practice this process for sentence corrections on your own to improve this part of the verbal section of the executive assessment.